Hello ladies, MBs and gentlemen. In this video I aim to explain with as much clarity as possible the difference between the left wing and the right wing of politics. What I'd like to look at first are some popular misconceptions of the left and right wing.
The left believes that the state should be the most powerful force in society.
The misconception that left wing means more government control and that right wing means less government control is a very American one that largely stems from the right-wing appropriation of the word libertarian. This is a popular misconception held by conservatives, particularly fiscal conservatives.
Fascism is a left-leaning principle. You can't have a fascist conservative. That doesn't make any sense.
The notion that somehow fascism is a left-leaning position is similarly confusing the left wing as synonymous with authoritarianism and the right as synonymous with libertarianism. This misconception isn't just grossly inaccurate, it's also dangerously inaccurate. Even among people with enough of a clue to recognise fascism as the hardest right-wing position, they often make the mistake of assuming the hardest left position is that of dictators like Joseph Stalin or Pol Pot. This is a popular misconception among centrists. After all, if fascism is evil and people like Stalin are evil, then good must be in the middle, right?
You know, if commies take over and just destroy capital, I think we're going to starve. I'm worried about fascists taking over and putting minorities to death. I'm worried about that too.
A similar centrist misconception when looking more at social politics than fiscal politics is the misconception that whereas the hard right believe in things like white supremacy, the hard left believe in black supremacy, or whereas the hard right believe in male supremacy, the hard left believe in female supremacy, etc., etc. Needless to say, these are all inaccurate views of the left and right that need correcting. Firstly, it's a good idea to look at where these terms left-wing and right-wing originate. They originate from the French Revolution. In the 1789 National Constituent Assembly, those who were most critical of the monarchy wished to end the privileges of the aristocracy, limit the privileges of the church, and put power in the hands of elected representatives with no power of veto for the monarchy were sat to the left of the president. By contrast, those who were supportive of the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the privileges of the church were sat to the right of the president. It's important for those who believe that left-wing means authoritarian and right-wing means libertarian to take note here. Being anti-monarchy, anti-aristocracy, and anti-theocracy is certainly not authoritarian. And of course, being pro-monarchy, pro-aristocracy, and pro-theocracy is certainly not libertarian. What distinguishes the left and right here is how they believe wealth and power should be distributed. The left believing it should be distributed equally amongst the people, and the right believing it should be distributed unequally, with some elite people or groups of people such as the monarchy, the aristocracy and the church deserving more power than the ordinary population. With that in mind, you might conclude that people who think left means authoritarian and right means libertarian have simply gotten it the wrong way round. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. It's helpful to visualise authoritarianism and libertarianism as a vertical axis of its own, intersecting with the horizontal left-to-right axis. Typically, in the authoritarian left corner, we would put people like Joseph Stalin and Pol Pot. In the authoritarian right corner, we would put people like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. In the libertarian right corner, we would put people like Murray Rothbard and Henry Mencken. In the libertarian left corner, we would put people like Peter Kropotkin and Rudolf Rocker. To revisit the popular misconceptions I brought up at the beginning of the video, the centrist misconception that the hard right is fascism and the hard left is people like Stalin and Pol Pot, as we can see, only concerns itself with the two authoritarian corners. It essentially completely ignores the existence of libertarianism and assumes that big government is a given and that it's simply a matter of what type of big government you have that determines whether your society is left or right or somewhere in between. But what about the misconception that left-wing means authoritarianism and right-wing means libertarianism? This misconception only seems to concern itself with the top left and the bottom right corners, and it is by and large a misconception held by those in the bottom right corner. Something worthy of note here is that the people in both authoritarian corners are famous dictators, whereas the people in both libertarian corners are famous political commentators, not people who've ever held government office. The libertarian left we'll discuss in a moment. For the moment, let's discuss why this might be the case for the libertarian right. The libertarian right are often largely concerned with economics more than social politics. They want to own their own businesses and run those businesses with little to no interference from the government. They also don't want much, if any, of the profit they earn from running these businesses to go towards funding a government or any public services, i.e. they don't want to pay much, if any, tax. In brief, they believe means of production should be privately controlled rather than state-controlled or publicly controlled. Now, right-wing libertarians who believe in absolutely no government and thus absolutely no tax like to call themselves anarcho-capitalists. I say like to call themselves because the very concept of being both an anarchist and a capitalist is contradictory. Anarchists believe in no state, whereas capitalism requires a state to function. Without a state to enforce private property rights, you cannot privately control the means of production, which is what capitalism is. With no state to enforce private property rights, means of production would simply end up under the control of those most capable of winning in a violent conflict over who gets to control means of production. The winners of such a conflict would in every practical way be indistinguishable from a totalitarian state, contradicting the notion of libertarianism completely. Both right libertarians such as Harry Binswanger and left libertarians such as David from the Anarchist Library agree on this point. Such a society would be very similar to the feudal system. The Libertarian Party of the United States don't believe in no government, which is kind of obvious given as they're a political party that routinely runs for government office. Precisely because they know this, they understand that if they desire a capitalist economy, at the very least there needs to be a government that enforces private property rights. By contrast, the authoritarian left believe in lots, if not total, government control of means of production. If you run a business under such a regime, you're running it how the government tell you to. It's not your business, as privatization is not allowed. So, how does the libertarian left differ from both the authoritarian left and the libertarian right? The libertarian left believe in neither private control of means of production nor in state control of means of production. Rather, they believe in direct public control of means of production. That is to say, means of production controlled democratically by a unionised workforce. This right here is what underlines the very significant difference between what the libertarian left and the libertarian right mean by liberty. The libertarian left desire liberty for the workers, i.e. the people in general. The libertarian right want liberty for private business owners. The way in which the libertarian left intend to secure liberty for the workers is for them to unionise and seize means of production from those who currently control it privately. When the Libertarian Party of the United States say they believe that government's only responsibility, if any, should be protecting people from force and fraud, such unions are exactly the sort of force they are referring to. What's important to note here is that while a libertarian right government might appear to be a small government from the perspective of business owners, what with the lack of restrictions and regulations as to how they do business, from the perspective of anyone trying to unionise their workforce, such a government will be every bit as restrictive and brutal as the big government of an authoritarian society would be. It's important to note as well that if you are gay and a business owner decides they don't want to employ gay people or allow gay people to purchase their goods and services, under a libertarian right government there would be no anti-discrimination laws to protect you from such discrimination. You could of course go elsewhere to seek employment or to buy things, but if every business in your realistic vicinity has the same policy, this leaves you rather stuck for the basic essentials of living. Even if only half the businesses in your vicinity have such policies though, this doesn't afford you the same liberty as a straight person would have, all else being equal. With this understood, the liberty offered by the libertarian right is very questionable. Rothbard himself openly gloated. One gratifying aspect of our rise to some prominence is that, for the first time in my memory, we, our side, had captured a crucial word from the enemy. Libertarians had long been simply a polite word for left-wing anarchists, that is, for anti-private property anarchists, either of the communist or syndicalist variety. In a libertarian left society, no one person controls any business. Each business is controlled democratically by the workforce. As such, the policy of a business has to be agreed upon by the workforce. It cannot be dictated by the bigotries of one person. This drastic difference in the understanding of liberty is why bottom unity, i.e. a proposed putting aside of differences between the libertarian left and the libertarian right, is not merely undesirable, but impossible. Left libertarian Peter Kropotkin's objection to government was that it enforces the notion that there is a superior type of person to others. In his own words, the origins of government have been carefully studied. Its powers have grown precisely in proportion as the division of society into the privileged and underprivileged classes was growing in the course of ages. Contrast that to the belief of right libertarian Mencken, who believes that there is in fact a superior type of person, and that government is somehow holding such people back from actualising their superiority. In his own words, All government in its essence is a conspiracy against the superior man. Its one permanent object is to oppress him and cripple him. If it be aristocratic in organisation, then it seeks to protect the man who is superior only in law against the man who is superior in fact. If it be democratic, then it seeks to protect the man who is inferior in every way against both. So what about the difference between the libertarian left and the authoritarian left? Whereas the libertarian left believe in direct worker control of means of production, the authoritarian left typically believe there should be a state made up of workers who control the means of production. In the case of Marx and Engels, they believed such a state should be a temporary measure during the transition from a capitalist society to a communist one. Essentially that society should be authoritarian left, but then gradually move to being libertarian left. In the case of Joseph Stalin, however, who considered himself to be a Marxist, this transition never happened. The state was very much to be a permanent fixture, and one that acted very much in its own interests, not those of the workers as a whole. The authoritarian left might argue that not all such governments would be as oppressive as Stalin's. However, the libertarian left typically reject even the notion of a more benevolent authoritarian left government, believing it foolish to, as Kropotkin argued, elect a few men and entrust them with the task of making laws on all possible subjects, of which most of them are utterly ignorant. There is a group of people among the authoritarian left who argue that the atrocities committed under Stalin's regime and similar regimes such as that of Pol Pot didn't really happen, and that the evidence that they did is somehow falsified in an act of Western capitalist propaganda. These people are called tankies, and despite their insistence that the atrocities of the authoritarian left didn't happen, their belief is at variance with the consensus of historians. So what is the difference between the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right? Friedrich and Brzezinski argue that fascist and communist dictatorships are basically alike, or at any rate more nearly like each other than like any other system of government, including earlier forms of autocracy. There are of course certain nuanced differences between the authoritarian left and authoritarian right regimes. For example, Stalin's regime was considerably less devoted to eugenics than the Nazis were. If you're interested in the specifics of these differences, Geyer and Fitzpatrick provide a comprehensive analysis which I'd recommend. What's undeniable, though, is that both regimes featured heavily controlling states that were brutally oppressive toward demographics they deemed inferior and to political dissenters. Economically, the Nazis employed a mixture of heavy privatization and state control. As Bell explains, there was private initiative in the production process, but no private initiative was allowed in the distribution of the product. Owners could act freely within their firms, but faced tight restrictions in the market. The Fascist Party of Italy similarly introduced lots of privatisation at a time when most of Europe was heading in the opposite direction and nationalising much of their industry. So, is economics the significant difference between the authoritarian right and the authoritarian left? Well, as Rocker argued, in Russia, where the so-called proletarian dictatorship has ripened into reality, the aspirations of a particular party for a political power have prevented any truly socialistic reconstruction of economy and have forced the country into the slavery of a grinding state capitalism, which lags behind the tyranny of the fascist states in nothing. This similarity between the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right is what informs one of the misconceptions I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that if fascists are bad and people like Stalin are bad, then centrism is the answer, a notion commonly known as horseshoe theory. This of course is based upon a false dichotomy between authoritarian left and authoritarian right, ignoring the existence of the libertarian left and the libertarian right. If we return to the French Revolution definitions of the left and right, it's safe to say that the authoritarian left really does not meet the criteria for being left-wing. Some might argue that the anti-religious stance of people like Stalin and Pol Pot matches with the left-wing opposition to religious privilege. But it's very important to understand the difference between opposing religious privilege, secularism, and making religious people into an oppressed group, state atheism. For this reason, I would argue that the word left in authoritarian left belongs very much in inverted commas. When it comes to the libertarian right, I would argue it's the word libertarian that belongs in inverted commas due to the inherently hierarchical nature of capitalism, as evidenced by the existence of a class system and its intersections with other oppressions. And also the flawed notion that capitalism can either exist without any government, or that the sort of government that is required in order for capitalism to function would be a small government. I suppose it would be prudent here to briefly discuss the difference between the authoritarian right and the libertarian right. Something right libertarians might bring up is that the Libertarian Party of the United States supports same-sex marriage. However, it would be more accurate to say they oppose the Defense of Marriage Act, which of course was anti-same-sex marriage legislation being pushed by the Republican Party. The reason for this isn't so much a passionate support for LGBTQ rights, so much as a passionate belief that government should have no involvement in marriage whatsoever, be it between same-sex couples, mixed-sex couples, or whatever else. As mentioned earlier, the Libertarian Party also opposes anti-discrimination laws for the same reason. They don't want government involved in the running of businesses. So you could argue they aren't opposing the oppression of LGBTQ people so much as privatising it. They are still vulnerable to oppression, it simply won't be government oppression, rather it will be corporate oppression. This, of course, again brings up the subject of religion, given as a lot of prejudice towards the LGBTQ community, particularly in America, is religious in nature. The Libertarian Party state that they favour the freedom to engage in or abstain from any religious activities that do not violate the rights of others. The problem with this from the perspective of the authoritarian right is that for them, violating the rights of others is often the whole appeal of religion. Take Brian Fisher, for example, who openly calls for the criminalisation of homosexuality and the banning of Muslims from migrating to the USA or serving in the US military. However, without anti-discrimination laws, while LGBTQ people or other minorities wouldn't be oppressed directly by such authoritarian laws, privately owned businesses would still be free to oppress them by refusing them employment or service, i.e. the privatization of oppression. As you can probably gather, I am libertarian left. I don't wish to insult anyone's intelligence by pretending that I'm politically impartial. It would be quite bizarre, in my opinion, for someone to study politics as much as I have and still be somehow undecided as to where they stand politically. I like to think, though, that I've been as fair as I can here, and I have drawn upon a variety of sources, not just libertarian left literature. If you disagree, you can, of course, make a video of your own. However, if you want me to take it seriously, I will need you to cite sources. I have also focused on the corners of the political square here. There are, of course, lots of political views that exist between the extremes, but if one understands the extremes, then they should be able to extrapolate for themselves what lies between them. If this isn't entirely clear, however, I will address this in a future video. In my next video on this subject, I hope to discuss the very confusing matter of labels, i.e. what people call themselves and what people get called when it comes to politics. One more point I'd like to make is that in the field of psychology, the way terms like authoritarian left and authoritarian right are used is somewhat different to how they're used in ordinary political theory. If you're referencing any psychological literature when making arguments, please bear this in mind and exercise caution. Thank you for watching. The comment section on this video will remain open so long as comments remain predominantly relevant and predominantly civil.